Hi, I'm Natalie. The morning I woke up in that recovery room, no flowers on the nightstand, no worried faces hovering over my bed, just the steady beep of machines and a nurse who kept glancing at the door like she expected someone to walk through it. I'd been under anesthesia for 6 hours. Emergency surgery, the kind where they tell your family to prepare for the worst. When I asked where my parents were, the nurse's face went soft with pity. She said they'd stepped out for coffee 3 hours ago. They never came back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know was that I'd been awake long enough to hear them in the hallway before the surgery, discussing not my recovery, but my inheritance. What they didn't realize was that I'd spent the last 2 years quietly preparing for the day they'd show their true colors. And what they definitely didn't expect was to see me sitting across from them in a courtroom, very much alive, very much in control, holding documents that would change everything. The pain started on a Tuesday morning in March. Not the sharp, immediate kind that sends you running to the emergency room, but the dull, persistent ache that settles into your lower right side and refuses to leave. I was 24, living in my small apartment in Southeast Portland, working as a graphic designer for a local marketing firm. My life was simple, predictable, and exactly how I liked it. I'd moved out of my parents' house in Beaverton 2 years earlier, much to their vocal disapproval. Richard and Diane Brooks had built Brooks Construction from the ground up, turning it into one of the most successful contracting companies in the Pacific Northwest. They lived in a sprawling ranch house with manicured lawns and 3 luxury cars in the driveway. Success to them meant control, and my independence had been a constant source of friction. That Tuesday, I tried to ignore the discomfort. I made coffee, answered emails, and spent the morning working on a logo design for a local brewery. But by noon, the pain had intensified to the point where I couldn't sit up straight. My coworker, Lisa, took one look at my pale face and insisted on driving me to St. Vincent Medical Center. The emergency room was a blur of fluorescent lights and hurried footsteps. Dr. Patel, a soft-spoken surgeon with kind eyes, ran a series of tests and delivered the diagnosis with gentle authority: acute appendicitis, with signs of perforation. I needed surgery immediately. The appendix had likely been inflamed for days, and waiting any longer could lead to life-threatening complications. I called my parents from the pre-op room. My mother answered on the 3rd ring, her voice crisp and professional as always. When I explained where I was and what was happening, there was a long pause. Not the shocked silence of a worried parent, but something else. Something calculating. "We'll be right there," she said finally, but her tone held the same detachment she used when discussing quarterly reports with her business partners. They arrived just as the nurses were preparing to wheel me into surgery. My father, Richard, stood at the foot of my bed in his expensive suit, checking his phone. My mother, Diane, positioned herself closer to the door than to my bedside, her purse clutched tightly against her chest. They looked more like reluctant visitors than parents watching their daughter face emergency surgery. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" my mother asked, but her eyes kept darting to the hallway. "Scared," I admitted, hoping for some reassurance, some warmth. Instead, my father glanced at his watch. "Dr. Patel seems competent," he said. "You're in good hands. This is routine surgery." Dr. Patel entered the room with a clipboard and a gentle smile. He explained the procedure, the risks, and the recovery process. "Standard appendectomy," he said. "But given the perforation, they'd need to be thorough." The surgery could take several hours, and there was a small chance of complications requiring additional procedures. As they prepared to take me into surgery, my mother leaned down and kissed my forehead. It should have been comforting, but something in her expression made my stomach clench beyond the physical pain. She whispered, "Everything will work out the way it's supposed to, Natalie." At the time, I thought she was being supportive. Later, I'd understand she was being prophetic. The anesthesia took hold quickly, pulling me into darkness with the promise that when I woke up, my parents would be there waiting. that when I opened my eyes, I'd see their worried faces and feel their relief that I was okay. I went under believing that family meant something, that blood bonds were unbreakable, that parents didn't abandon their children in hospital rooms. I was wrong about all of it. When consciousness returned, it came in waves. First, the awareness of pain medication flowing through my IV, then the recognition of where I was. The recovery room was dimly lit, designed for rest and healing. Machines beeped steadily around me, monitoring my vital signs and ensuring my body was responding well to the surgery. The procedure had taken longer than expected, 6 hours. Dr. Patel later told me they'd found more complications than the scans had revealed. Additional inflammation, some internal bleeding that required careful attention. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough to extend the surgery significantly. I turned my head slowly, expecting to see my parents in the chairs beside my bed. The chairs were empty. Not just empty, but clearly hadn't been occupied recently. No indentations in the cushions, no personal items left behind. No signs that anyone had been keeping vigil during my recovery. Nurse Caroline Wright appeared at my bedside, her face kind but cautious. She checked my IV, monitored my blood pressure, and asked about my pain level. When I asked about my parents, her expression shifted slightly. She glanced toward the door, then back at me with the careful neutrality of someone who'd seen too much family drama in hospital settings. "They stepped out for coffee about 3 hours ago," she said gently. "I'm sure they'll be back soon." But even as she said it, something in her tone suggested she wasn't sure at all. I asked for my phone, thinking maybe they'd texted or called with an explanation. Nothing. No messages, no missed calls, no indication that they were concerned about my condition or expected recovery time. I lay there in the recovery room, staring at the ceiling tiles and trying to process what was happening. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Maybe there had been an emergency at the construction company. Maybe Tyler, my older brother, had needed them for something urgent. Maybe they'd gotten lost in the hospital's maze-like corridors and couldn't find their way back to my room. But deep down, in the part of my mind that had been quietly cataloging years of subtle emotional distance and conditional love, I knew the truth. They'd left. Not because of an emergency or confusion or any legitimate reason. They'd left because they'd wanted to leave. Because watching their daughter recover from surgery was less important than whatever else demanded their attention. The hours passed slowly. Nurses rotated through their shifts, each one asking if I needed them to call anyone. I kept saying my parents would be back soon, clinging to the hope that this was all a misunderstanding. By evening, when Dr. Patel made his rounds, even he seemed surprised by their absence. "How are you feeling, Natalie?" he asked, reviewing my chart. "The surgery went well. We cleaned out all the inflammation and repaired the perforation. You should make a full recovery." "When can I go home?" I asked, though the question felt hollow. Home to what? To parents who'd abandoned me during the most vulnerable moment of my adult life? "Tomorrow morning, if everything looks good overnight," he said. Then more gently, "Is there someone else we can call? A friend or family member who could pick you up?" That's when it really hit me. I was alone. Not just in the hospital, but in a way that went much deeper than physical presence. I'd been alone in my family for years, maybe always, but I'd been too hopeful, too willing to make excuses to see it clearly. I called Lisa, my coworker, who immediately offered to pick me up the next day. She arrived that Thursday morning with flowers, homemade soup, and a fury that matched my own growing anger. As we left the hospital, she kept glancing at me like she expected me to break down crying. But I wasn't crying. I was thinking. The drive back to my apartment gave me time to process what had happened, but also to remember something I'd tried to forget. Just before the anesthesia had taken hold, as they wheeled me toward the operating room, I'd heard voices in the hallway.
My parents' voices, speaking in the low, urgent tones they used when discussing business matters. If something happens, my mother had said, the trust fund reverts to Tyler automatically. She never updated her beneficiary information after moving out. Good thing, my father had replied. She's been making poor decisions lately. Living in that apartment, working for that small company instead of joining the business. Maybe this will teach her some perspective. At the time, drugged and terrified, I dismissed it as a stress-induced hallucination. But now, sitting in Lisa's car with clear thoughts and growing clarity, I realized what I'd actually heard. My parents discussing my potential death as if it were a business opportunity. Planning for my absence as if it were a convenience rather than a tragedy. The trust fund they'd mentioned was something I'd almost forgotten about. My grandmother, my mother's mother, had established it years ago with the intention of providing financial security for her grandchildren. She died when I was 18, leaving both Tyler and me substantial inheritances that we'd gain access to on our 25th birthdays. Mine was still months away, but the documents were already prepared and filed. What my parents didn't know was that I'd recently had those documents reviewed by an attorney.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Not because I suspected anything, but because I'd wanted to understand my financial future as I planned my career path. What I discovered during that review was that my grandmother had included provisions I'd never known about. Protection clauses designed to prevent family members from manipulating or accessing the funds inappropriately. More importantly, she'd established a secondary account that I'd gained access to 2 years earlier on my 22nd birthday. A smaller amount, but significant enough to provide real independence. My parents had never known about this secondary inheritance because my grandmother had specifically requested that it remain private until I was mature enough to handle it responsibly. That evening, alone in my apartment with Lisa's soup warming on the stove, I made a decision. I opened my laptop and began researching. Not just the trust fund details, but my parents' business practices, their financial history, and their legal obligations as my next of kin during a medical emergency. What I found was illuminating. Brooks Construction had been struggling more than they'd let on. Several major contracts had fallen through in recent months, and they'd been borrowing against their personal assets to keep the business afloat. My inheritance, when it became available, would solve many of their financial problems. But only if something happened to me before I gained full legal control. I thought about my grandmother, a woman who'd built her own successful real estate business decades before it was common for women to do so. She'd always been protective of me, sometimes to my parents' annoyance. During one of our last conversations before her death, she held my hand and said something that hadn't made sense at the time. "People will try to love you for what you can give them, not for who you are," she'd said. When that happens, remember that your worth isn't measured by what others can take from you.
I'd thought she was being overly philosophical, maybe even a little paranoid. Now I understood she'd been preparing me for exactly this moment. For the day when I'd discover that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally were actually calculating the value of my absence. The next few days passed in a strange haze of physical recovery and emotional awakening. I took sick leave from work, partly because I needed time to heal, but mostly because I needed time to plan. My parents called once, 2 days after the surgery, with a brief check-in that felt more like a business obligation than genuine concern. They asked if I needed anything, but in a tone that clearly hoped the answer would be no. I told them I was fine, recovering well, and would be back to normal soon. I didn't mention the trust fund research or the legal consultations I'd begun scheduling. I didn't talk about the growing clarity I felt about our relationship or the decisions I was preparing to make. I kept my voice light, grateful, and completely normal. Because I'd learned something important during those long hours in the hospital room. Sometimes the best way to protect yourself isn't to fight back immediately, but to let people think they've won while you build something stronger underneath. My grandmother had taught me that without me even realizing it. She'd prepared me for this exact situation, not just financially, but emotionally and strategically.
That weekend, I had my first meeting with Marcus Reed, the attorney who'd helped me understand my inheritance paperwork months earlier. He was a thoughtful man in his 50s who specialized in family law and estate planning. When I told him about the hospital incident and what I'd overheard, his expression grew serious. Family abandonment during medical emergencies can have legal implications, he said carefully, especially when there are financial motivations involved. But we'd need to be very strategic about how we proceed. I explained about the trust fund, the timeline, and my growing suspicions about my parents' financial situation. Marcus listened without judgment, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me thoughtfully. "Your grandmother was a smart woman," he said finally. "These protection clauses in the trust are more comprehensive than most. She clearly anticipated that someone might try to manipulate or pressure you regarding the inheritance." He opened a thick folder and showed me documents I'd never seen before. Additional provisions that wouldn't take effect until specific circumstances arose. Protections that would activate if I faced family coercion, medical abandonment, or attempts to access my inheritance inappropriately. "She essentially created a legal safety net," Marcus explained. "But it requires you to document any attempts at manipulation or abandonment. Do you have any evidence of what happened at the hospital?" I thought about the overheard conversation, the unexplained absence, the casual tone of their follow-up call. "Some," I said, "but I could get more." That's when Marcus introduced me to an idea that would change everything. Instead of confronting my parents directly or cutting them off immediately, he suggested we build a comprehensive case that would protect not just my current inheritance, but any future attempts they might make to exploit our family relationship. Your grandmother included provisions for something called family accountability proceedings. It's essentially a legal process that can transfer full control of family trusts and inheritances to the intended beneficiary if other family members have demonstrated harmful or exploitative behavior. The process would require evidence, documentation, and careful timing. But if successful, it wouldn't just protect my inheritance, it would remove my parents' ability to influence any aspect of my financial future, while simultaneously exposing their behavior to legal scrutiny. As I left Marcus's office that day, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not just anger or hurt, but actual power.
The power that comes from understanding exactly what game is being played and having the tools to win it. My parents thought they were dealing with the same naive daughter who'd called them from the emergency room 3 days earlier. They had no idea that person was gone, replaced by someone who'd finally seen the truth and was prepared to act on it. Walking back to my car through downtown Portland, I thought about my grandmother again, about her business success, her fierce independence, and her insistence on preparing me for a future I couldn't yet imagine. She'd known something I was only beginning to understand, that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you most need protection from. That evening, I sat in my apartment with my laptop open, medical bills spread across my coffee table, and a legal pad covered with notes and timelines. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning justice. Not just for myself, but for the memory of a grandmother who'd worked too hard building something meaningful to let it be destroyed by people who saw dollar signs instead of family bonds. The preliminary research was finished. The legal groundwork was in place. Now came the most important part, letting my parents think they were still in control while I built the case that would ultimately strip that control away completely. I picked up my phone and dialed their number. When my mother answered, I made my voice warm and slightly vulnerable, the tone of a daughter who still needed her parents despite everything that had happened. "Hi, Mom," I said. "I was wondering if you and Dad might want to have dinner this weekend. I've been thinking about everything, and I'd love to talk about the future. Maybe about the trust fund and what my options might be." The eagerness in her voice when she agreed told me everything I needed to know. They thought I was ready to play their game. What they didn't realize was that I'd already changed the rules.
That dinner happened on a rainy Saturday evening in April. I drove to their house in Beaverton, the same sprawling ranch where I'd grown up, where family dinners had once felt warm and meaningful. Now, pulling into the circular driveway past the manicured landscaping and luxury vehicles, everything looked different. Not physically, but in the way you see a familiar place with new understanding. My mother opened the door wearing her standard hostess smile, the one she reserved for important business clients and social obligations. She hugged me carefully, avoiding my still tender surgical sight, and commented on how well I looked. My father appeared from his home office, phone still pressed to his ear, finishing what sounded like a heated conversation about delayed payments and contract disputes. The dining room table was set with their finest china, the kind they usually reserved for holiday gatherings or when they wanted to impress someone. Fresh flowers adorned the centerpiece, and my mother had prepared my childhood favorite meal, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables. Under different circumstances, the effort would have touched me. Now, it felt strategic. Tyler joined us halfway through dinner, arriving late with apologies about traffic and work obligations. My older brother had always been the golden child, the one who'd joined the family business straight out of college and lived his life according to our parents' expectations. He kissed my cheek and asked about my recovery with what seemed like genuine concern, but even his warmth felt calculated now. The conversation remained light through the main course. They asked about my job, my apartment, my plans for the upcoming spring season. I answered pleasantly, sharing details about new clients and design projects, playing the role of the recovered daughter who appreciated their concern and support. But underneath the pleasant small talk, I could feel the tension building towards something more significant. It was my mother who finally steered the conversation toward its real purpose.
As she served dessert, homemade apple pie that reminded me of childhood birthdays, she mentioned how the surgery had made her think about family planning and financial security. "We've been discussing it," she said, glancing meaningfully at my father, "and we think it might be wise for you to consider some changes to your inheritance arrangements." My father leaned forward, his expression shifting into business mode. "Your grandmother's trust fund comes available next year, and there are significant tax advantages to restructuring it now. If we move the assets into the family business, we can shelter most of it from estate taxes and provide you with a steady income stream instead of a lump sum." I took a careful bite of pie, letting the sweetness dissolve on my tongue while I processed their proposal. They were suggesting that I sign over my inheritance to Brooks Construction, allowing them to manage it as part of their business assets, in exchange for what they described as guaranteed monthly payments. On the surface, it sounded protective, even generous. In reality, it would give them complete control over money that was legally mine. "That sounds complicated," I said mildly. "I'd need to understand all the details before making any decisions." Tyler jumped in, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed in what he was selling. "The family business is solid, Nat. We've got contracts lined up through next year, and the real estate market is stronger than ever. Your inheritance would be protected and growing instead of just sitting in some bank account." What they didn't mention, but what my research had revealed, was that Brooks Construction was facing serious financial difficulties. Several major contracts had been canceled due to delays and cost overruns. They'd borrowed heavily against their personal assets to cover operating expenses, and creditors were beginning to pressure them for payment. My inheritance wouldn't just be protected in their business, it would be used to save their business. My mother reached across the table and patted my hand. "We know it's a lot to think about, especially after everything you've been through, but family takes care of family, and we want to make sure you're secure." The irony was breathtaking. The same people who'd abandoned me during surgery were now positioning themselves as my financial protectors. But I kept my expression neutral, even grateful, as I listened to their pitch. "Can I see the paperwork?" I asked. "I'd like to review everything carefully."
My father's eyes lit up with what looked like relief. Of course. We had our attorney draw up the documents last week. Nothing official, just preliminary drafts to show you what we're thinking. He disappeared into his office and returned with a leather folder containing several legal documents. As I flipped through them, my heart rate increased, but I kept my breathing steady. The papers didn't just transfer my inheritance to the family business. They established a pattern of financial dependency that would give my parents control over my money for decades. The proposed arrangement included monthly payments that would be subject to family consensus regarding my life choices. If I made decisions they deemed financially irresponsible, like staying in my current job or maintaining my independent living situation, the payments could be reduced or suspended entirely. It was a financial leash disguised as a safety net. "This is very thorough," I said, closing the folder. "I'll need some time to review it properly. Maybe have my own attorney look it over." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. My mother's smile became more fixed, and my father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Tyler looked confused, as if the idea of needing independent legal advice was somehow insulting to the family. "Of course," my mother said, but her tone suggested this wasn't the response they'd expected. "Though I should mention that time is somewhat of a factor. There are certain filing deadlines that could affect the tax advantages we're trying to secure." It was a classic pressure tactic, creating artificial urgency to prevent careful consideration.
I nodded understandingly and promised to review everything quickly. As the evening wound down, they walked me to my car with assurances that they were available to answer any questions that might arise. Driving home through the quiet suburban streets, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and clarity. These people had raised me, celebrated my achievements, comforted me through childhood disappointments, but they'd also calculated the value of my potential death and were now attempting to financially control my adult life. The disconnect was staggering. Back in my apartment, I spread the documents across my kitchen table and began reading every word carefully. The legal language was complex, but the intent was clear. They wanted to convert my inheritance into a trust fund that they control permanently. He explained how the proposed arrangement would work in practice. My parents would have complete discretion over the monthly payments, with broad authority to modify or suspend them based on their judgment of my life choices. The inheritance principal would be permanently tied up in their business, making it impossible for me to access for major purchases, investments, or emergencies without their approval. The timing is also suspicious, Marcus noted. They're pushing for this restructuring just months before you gain full legal control of the inheritance. It suggests they know their window of opportunity is closing. We spent hours reviewing my grandmother's original trust documents, looking for protections she might have included. What we found exceeded my expectations. My grandmother had anticipated exactly this scenario, including specific provisions that would protect the inheritance from family coercion or manipulation. The trust included what she'd called a family integrity clause that would transfer full control of all assets to me immediately if other family members attempt to manipulate or exploit the inheritance for their own benefit. The clause required evidence of attempted coercion, but the standards were lower than typical legal proceedings. My grandmother had designed it to protect her grandchildren from exactly the kind of situation I was facing. "Your grandmother was clearly concerned about your parents' financial judgment," Marcus explained. "These provisions suggest she didn't trust them to prioritize your interests over their own. More importantly, activating the family integrity clause would do more than just protect my current inheritance. It would also trigger a comprehensive review of all family financial arrangements, including Tyler's inheritance and any assets my parents had claimed were held in trust for family members." The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. I could protect myself completely, but doing so would likely destroy any remaining relationship with my family. The little girl in me who still wanted their love and approval hesitated, but the adult who'd woken up alone in a hospital room after major surgery knew it had to be done. Marcus helped me prepare a detailed response to my parents' proposal. On the surface, it would appear to be a counterproposal that addressed my concerns while moving toward their desired outcome. In reality, it would be a legal trap that would document their coercive intentions while giving me time to activate my grandmother's protections.
The counterproposal requested detailed financial information about Brooks Construction, including recent profit and loss statements, outstanding debts, and projected revenue. It also suggested modifications to their proposal that would maintain my direct control over the inheritance principal while allowing them to manage investment decisions. Finally, it included a requirement for independent financial counseling to ensure I fully understood the implications of any arrangement. They'll resist these modifications, Marcus predicted, but their resistance will help document their true intentions. If they're genuinely trying to protect your interests, they should welcome transparency and independent oversight. I called my mother that Thursday to schedule another dinner meeting. She agreed immediately, with an enthusiasm that confirmed my suspicions about their financial urgency. This time, they suggested meeting at an upscale restaurant in downtown Portland. Neutral territory that would prevent the kind of emotional manipulation that family settings could facilitate. The restaurant was one of those places that served small portions on large plates, where the wine list cost more than most people's grocery budgets, and business deals were negotiated over artisanal cheese courses. My parents arrived early and had already secured a quiet corner table when I walked in. My father stood to greet me, his handshake firm and his smile confident. He was dressed in his most expensive suit, the one he wore for important business presentations. My mother had chosen a conservative dress and pearl necklace that projected maternal authority. They looked like successful professionals preparing to close an important deal, which, I realize, was exactly what they thought they were doing. The conversation began with polite inquiries about my health and work, but moved quickly to the main topic. I presented my counterproposal calmly, explaining that I'd reviewed their documents carefully and had some questions and suggestions. As Marcus had predicted, their enthusiasm dimmed noticeably when I began outlining my modifications. The request for financial transparency about Brooks Construction made my father shift uncomfortably in his seat. The suggestion of independent financial counseling caused my mother to purse her lips in disapproval. "Natalie," my father said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he thought someone was being unreasonable, "we're trying to help you here. Adding all these complications defeats the purpose of simplifying your financial situation." "I appreciate that," I replied, "but this is a significant decision that will affect my entire future. I want to make sure I understand all the implications." My mother leaned forward, her expression shifting into what I recognized as her concerned parent mode. "Sweetheart, we've been managing family finances for decades. Tyler has never questioned our judgment, and his inheritance has grown substantially under our management." It was an interesting slip. Tyler's inheritance wasn't supposed to come available for another 3 years, but she was speaking about it as if they already controlled it. I filed that information away for later investigation while maintaining my pleasant demeanor. "I'm sure you have," I said. "That's why I'd love to see how successful you've been. The financial statements would help me understand how the family business operates." The silence that followed stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. My parents exchanged a look that spoke volumes about conversations they'd had in private. Finally, my father cleared his throat and attempted to redirect the discussion. "The specific financials aren't really relevant to your situation," he said. "We're talking about a separate trust arrangement that would be legally protected from business operations." But I'd done enough research to know that wasn't true. The documents they'd presented would make my inheritance directly subject to the business's financial performance and their management decisions.
There would be no legal separation between my money and their operations. "I think I need to have my attorney review everything more carefully," I said, keeping my tone apologetic rather than confrontational. "This is all more complex than I initially realized." The mask slipped for just a moment. My father's jaw clenched, and my mother's eyes flashed with irritation before she quickly restored her understanding smile. In that brief instant, I saw them as they really were. Not loving parents trying to protect their daughter, but business people frustrated that a deal wasn't closing as expected. "Of course," my mother said, but her voice carried a new edge. "Though I hope you understand that some opportunities are time-sensitive. We can't hold these arrangements open indefinitely." There it was again, the
artificial urgency designed to prevent careful consideration. I nodded as if I understood their position while mentally noting another example of manipulative behavior for my growing file. The dinner ended with polite promises to stay in touch and continue our discussions. They paid the check with obvious reluctance, as if they'd expected the meal to conclude with signed documents rather than more delays. I thanked them for their patience and promised to have answers soon. Walking to my car through the downtown Portland streets, I felt the weight of what was happening settle around me like a heavy coat. These people had raised me, taught me to ride a bike, celebrated my high school graduation, walked me through my first heartbreak. But they'd also abandoned me during emergency surgery and were now trying to steal my financial independence. The emotional whiplash was exhausting. Part of me wanted to believe there was still some way to maintain a relationship with them, some explanation that would make their behavior understandable, if not forgivable. But the evidence was mounting too quickly to ignore. That night, I called Marcus and filled him in on the dinner conversation. He listened without comment as I described their resistance to transparency and their continued pressure tactics. "They're not going to give up easily," he said when I finished. "People in their financial situation get desperate, and desperate people make poor decisions. We need to be prepared for them to escalate their pressure." He was right. Over the next week, my parents began calling more frequently, always with new urgency about the inheritance decision. My mother mentioned that Tyler was concerned about family unity and thought I was being unnecessarily suspicious. My father called to say their attorney had identified additional tax benefits that would be lost if we didn't act quickly. Each conversation followed the same pattern: artificial warmth followed by increasing pressure, presented as concern for my welfare, but clearly motivated by their own financial needs. I responded to each call with polite consideration and promises to decide soon, while documenting every conversation in detailed notes. But the most revealing call came from Tyler himself, late on a Friday evening when he'd clearly been drinking. His voice was slurred with alcohol and frustration as he demanded to know why I was making things so difficult for the family. "They've been taking care of your money for years," he said, his words tumbling together. "Ever since Grandma died, they've been managing everything to make sure we'd all be set up. Why are you suddenly acting like they're trying to cheat you?" It was another slip, more significant than my mother's earlier comment. Tyler was confirming that my parents had been managing inheritance money that they shouldn't have had access to yet. Not just planning for future management, but actively controlling assets that belonged to me and Tyler. I kept my voice calm and curious, encouraging him to talk while I recorded the conversation on my phone. Tyler was drunk enough to be honest, but not so drunk that his statements would be legally inadmissible.
He painted a picture of financial management that went far beyond what my parents had disclosed, including investments made with inheritance money and business decisions that directly affected assets that should have been protected in trust. When he finally hung up, I had enough evidence to trigger my grandmother's family integrity clause. But I also had something else: a clear understanding of just how deep their financial manipulation had gone. This wasn't just about my inheritance or their current business problems. They'd been treating Tyler's money and mine as their personal slush fund for years. The next morning, I sat in my apartment with coffee growing cold in my hands and legal documents spread across every surface. I thought about my grandmother, who'd built her fortune through careful planning and fierce independence. I thought about the young woman who'd called her parents from an emergency room, still believing in family loyalty and unconditional love. And I thought about the person I was becoming, someone who understood that love shouldn't come with financial strings attached. Marcus had scheduled our final planning meeting for Monday morning. By then, I needed to decide whether to activate the nuclear option my grandmother had provided. It would protect me completely, but it would also expose years of financial manipulation and likely destroy any possibility of reconciliation with my family. I spent the weekend walking through the neighborhoods of Southeast Portland, watching families in parks and coffee shops, trying to understand what real family love looked like. What I saw were parents who showed up for their children without calculating the cost, who prioritized their kids' well-being over their own convenience or financial benefit. Sunday evening, I made my decision. I called Marcus and told him to prepare the Family Integrity Clause documentation. If my parents wanted to treat me like a business asset rather than a daughter, then I would respond like a business owner protecting her investments. The little girl who'd wanted their approval was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that sometimes protecting yourself means walking away from people who see your love as a weakness to exploit. My grandmother had given me the tools to fight back. It was time to use them. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that seems to seep into your bones and stay there. I sat in Marcus Raid's office at 8 sharp, wearing my most professional outfit and carrying a briefcase that contained months of careful documentation. The weight of what I was about to set in motion pressed against my chest like a physical force. Marcus reviewed the final paperwork one more time, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he flipped through each page methodically. The Family Integrity Clause documentation was more comprehensive than I'd imagined. My grandmother hadn't just created a simple protection mechanism, she'd designed a complete legal framework that would investigate and remedy family financial abuse. Once we file this, Marcus said, setting down the papers and looking at me directly, there's no going back. The court will freeze all trust assets pending investigation, and your parents will be served with legal papers within 48 hours. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? I thought about waking up alone in that hospital room, about Tyler's drunken admission that they'd been managing money that wasn't theirs to control, about the artificial urgency and manipulation tactics they'd used to pressure me into signing away my financial independence. The answer came without hesitation. Yes, file everything. Marcus nodded and began the process that would change my family forever. He submitted the documentation electronically to the probate court, initiated the asset freeze through the trust management company, and scheduled the required family notification process. Within hours, legal machinery that had been dormant for years would spring into action with the precision my grandmother had engineered. But filing the paperwork was only the beginning.
The Family Integrity Clause required me to document ongoing attempts at coercion or manipulation. My grandmother had understood that financial abusers rarely give up easily, and she'd created a system that would capture their escalating behavior as they became more desperate. I spent the rest of Monday preparing for what Marcus called the reaction phase. My parents would receive official notification of the asset freeze by Tuesday afternoon. Based on Marcus's experience with similar cases, their response would likely follow a predictable pattern: confusion, anger, desperate attempts to contact me, and increasingly aggressive pressure tactics as they realized the scope of what was happening. They'll probably try to convince you this is all a misunderstanding, Marcus warned. They might even offer to return money or make concessions, but don't let them manipulate you into withdrawing the complaint. The investigation needs to run its course. He helped me prepare for the conversations that were coming. We scripted responses to common manipulation tactics, established communication protocols that would protect me legally, and set up recording systems that would capture any threats or coercive behavior. My grandmother's protection framework was about to be stress-tested by the very people it was designed to thwart. Tuesday morning, I went to work as usual, focusing on design projects and client meetings as if my world wasn't about to explode. But by lunchtime, my phone had begun buzzing with increasingly frantic calls from my parents. I let each call go to voicemail, following Marcus's advice to avoid direct communication until the initial legal process was complete. The first voicemail was from my mother, her voice tight with confusion and barely controlled anger. "Natalie, we need to talk immediately. There's been some kind of legal mix-up with your grandmother's trust. Call me back as soon as you get this." The second came from my father an hour later, his tone more aggressive. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you need to fix this situation right now. Our attorney says you've initiated some kind of legal action against the family. This is completely inappropriate."
By evening, the voicemails had escalated to threats of cutting off all family contact and demands that I explain myself immediately. Tyler called twice, his messages alternating between bewilderment and anger as he tried to understand why his inheritance was suddenly frozen, along with mine. I listened to each message carefully, taking notes on the tone, content, and implied threats. Every word they spoke was building the case that would ultimately protect me from further manipulation. Their anger was revealing the truth they'd worked so hard to hide. They'd never seen me as a daughter whose well-being mattered, but as an asset whose value they controlled. Wednesday brought a new development. My mother appeared at my office building, waiting in the lobby with the kind of steely determination I recognized from her most challenging business negotiations. When the receptionist called to announce I had a visitor, my stomach clenched with anticipation and dread. I met her in a small conference room, keeping the door open and my phone recording as Marcus had instructed. She sat across from me with perfect posture, her purse clutched in her lap, her expression cycling between maternal concern and barely suppressed fury. "Natalie," she began, her voice carefully modulated, "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Your father and I received some very confusing legal documents yesterday, and we need to sort this out immediately." I maintained steady eye contact, keeping my voice neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean. Can you be more specific about what kind of documents?" Her composure cracked slightly. "Don't play games with me. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You've somehow triggered a freeze on family trust assets and initiated an investigation into our financial management. This is absolutely unacceptable."
The mask was slipping away piece by piece. The concerned mother persona was being replaced by the business executive who'd built Brooks Construction through force of will and strategic intimidation. But I'd learned to match her energy without being overwhelmed by it. "I've been working with an attorney to understand my inheritance rights," I said calmly. "If that's triggered some kind of investigation, it suggests there might be legitimate concerns about how the trust has been managed." She leaned forward, her eyes flashing. "Legitimate concerns? We've protected and grown your inheritance for years. Every decision we've made has been in your best interest. And this is how you repay us? By sicking lawyers on your own family?" "When you say you've been managing my inheritance," I replied, "can you explain what specific authority you had to do that? My understanding is that the trust assets weren't supposed to be accessible until my 25th birthday." The question hit its mark. She sat back in her chair, her jaw working as she processed the implications of what I'd just said. I could see her calculating how much I knew and how much I could prove. The silence stretched between us like a challenge. "We had power of attorney for trust management," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "Your grandmother designated us as interim managers until you came of age." It was a lie, and we both knew it. My research had shown that the trust included no such provisions. My grandmother had specifically structured it to prevent family members from accessing the funds before the designated age. But watching my mother lie so smoothly to my face removed any lingering doubts about the path I'd chosen. "I'd like to see that documentation," I said. "My attorney would be very interested in reviewing the power of attorney paperwork." Her composure finally shattered completely. "Your attorney? You mean the stranger you're paying to destroy your own family? Natalie, I cannot believe you would do this to us. After everything we've done for you, everything we've sacrificed to give you opportunities and security, this is how you thank us? By sicking lawyers on your own family?" "When you say you've been managing my inheritance," I replied, "can you explain what specific authority you had to do that? My understanding is that the trust assets weren't supposed to be accessible until my 25th birthday." After she left, I sat in the conference room for several minutes, processing what had just happened. The woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me to braid my hair and helped me with homework, had just threatened me for protecting my own inheritance.
The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but the recording on my phone captured every word for the legal file that was building. Thursday brought a different approach. Tyler called during my lunch break, his voice heavy with disappointment and confusion. Unlike our parents, his manipulation was more subtle, built on shared history and genuine affection that made it harder to resist. Nat, what's going on? Mom and Dad are devastated. They're saying you've accused them of stealing from us, but that can't be right. They've always taken care of family money responsibly. I could hear the genuine bewilderment in his voice, and it softened something in my chest. Tyler wasn't malicious the way our parents were. He was simply naive about their true nature, conditioned by years of being the favored child to trust their judgment without question. Tyler, do you know specifically how much money you're supposed to inherit? Some. Why? Have you ever seen actual statements or documentation showing how much is there and how it's been invested? There was a long pause.
No, but I trust them to handle it properly. They're successful business people. Their business is failing, I said gently. They've been borrowing against personal assets to keep Brooks Construction afloat, and they owe significant money to creditors. Your inheritance and mine have been used as collateral for business loans. The silence that followed was painful. I could almost hear Tyler's worldview reshaping itself as he processed information that contradicted everything he'd believed about our family's financial stability. That can't be true, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. The legal investigation will determine exactly what's been happening, I said. But Tyler, think about it. Why would they be so desperate for me to sign my inheritance over to them if everything was as secure as they claim? After we hung up, I felt the weight of what I was destroying settling around me like a funeral shroud. Tyler would never look at our parents the same way again. The family unity we'd all pretended existed was being exposed as an elaborate fiction built on financial manipulation and conditional love. Friday brought the most aggressive response yet. My father appeared at my apartment building that evening, his face flushed with anger and what might have been alcohol. The building's security cameras captured him pounding on the main entrance door and demanding that someone let him speak to his daughter. I watched from my third-floor window as he paced back and forth on the sidewalk, talking loudly on his phone. Even from that distance, I could see the desperation in his body language, the way his carefully maintained business executive facade had crumbled under legal pressure. My phone rang within minutes. His voice was rougher than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the polished charm he usually projected. Natalie, you need to come down here right now and explain what the hell you think you're doing to this family. I'm not coming down, I said calmly. If you want to talk, we can schedule a meeting with our attorneys present. Attorneys? His voice rose to a shout. I'm your father. I shouldn't need a lawyer to talk to my own daughter. You're destroying everything we've built, everything your grandmother wanted for this family. The irony was stunning. He was invoking my grandmother's memory while trying to convince me to abandon the protections she'd specifically created. But his desperation was also revealing. The investigation had clearly uncovered more financial irregularities than even I had suspected. What specifically am I destroying? I asked. If you've been managing the trust fund appropriately, the investigation should confirm that and everything will return to normal. You know it's not that simple, he snapped. Business finances are complicated. Money gets moved around for tax purposes and investment opportunities. Just because something looks irregular doesn't mean it's improper. It was an admission disguised as a defense. He was acknowledging that the investigation would find financial irregularities while trying to preemptively justify them as legitimate business practices. But moving trust fund money for investment opportunities was exactly the kind of unauthorized access my grandmother's protections were designed to prevent. Then you'll be able to explain everything to the investigators. If it's all legitimate, you have nothing to worry about. The conversation ended with him cursing and demanding that I fix the situation immediately. From my window, I watched him pace for another 20 minutes before finally leaving. The security footage would be another piece of evidence documenting his increasingly erratic behavior as the legal pressure mounted. Saturday morning brought a surprise that changed everything. Marcus called me at home, his voice carrying an excitement I'd never heard before. Natalie, You need to get down to my office immediately. The preliminary investigation results are in, and they're more significant than we anticipated. I drove downtown through the Saturday morning quiet, my mind racing through possibilities.
Marcus had warned me that investigations could take weeks or months to complete. Getting preliminary results after only 5 days suggested they'd found something obvious and substantial. Marcus met me at his office door, holding a thick folder of documents that hadn't been there earlier in the week. His expression was serious, but satisfied, like a prosecutor who just discovered the smoking gun in a major case. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What we've found goes far beyond simple mismanagement. Your parents have been systematically draining both trust funds for almost 3 years." He opened the folder and spread financial documents across his desk. Bank statements, loan applications, transfer records, and investment portfolios painted a picture of coordinated financial theft that was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. "They've borrowed over $400,000 against your inheritance alone," Marcus explained, pointing to loan documents that used my trust fund as collateral. "Tyler's account has been used similarly, though for smaller amounts. The money has been funneled directly into Brooks Construction to cover operating expenses and debt payments." But that wasn't the worst of it. The investigation had also uncovered evidence that my parents had been planning to declare Brooks Construction bankrupt within the next 6 months, which would have eliminated their obligation to repay the loans while keeping the money they'd already extracted from our inheritances. "Your grandmother's protections saved you from losing everything," Marcus said. "If you'd signed their restructuring agreement, you would have essentially been signing away money that had already been stolen, while giving them legal authority to take whatever remained." The documents showed a level of premeditation that was staggering. My parents hadn't just made poor financial decisions or bent the rules for temporary convenience. They'd executed a multi-year plan to steal their children's inheritances while maintaining plausible deniability about their actions. "What happens now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Now we file criminal charges," Marcus said simply. "This isn't just a civil matter anymore. What they've done constitutes felony theft and fraud. The district attorney will want to prosecute them to the full extent of the law." The room seemed to tilt around me as the implications sank in. My parents weren't just going to lose access to my inheritance. They were going to face criminal prosecution for felony charges that could result in significant prison time. The family protection I'd initiated had uncovered crimes that would destroy not just our relationships, but their freedom. Marcus continued explaining the legal process, but his words faded into background noise as I processed the magnitude of what was happening. I'd thought I was protecting myself from financial manipulation. Instead, I'd uncovered a criminal conspiracy that would send my parents to prison and destroy any possibility of family reconciliation. The little girl who'd wanted their love and approval was finally completely gone. In her place sat a woman who understood that sometimes protecting yourself means accepting that the people who were supposed to love you were actually criminals who saw your trust as an opportunity for exploitation. Outside Marcus's office windows, Portland continued its Saturday routine. Families walked through the downtown streets, heading to farmers markets and coffee shops, living the kind of normal life I'd once thought I had. But normal families didn't steal from their children. Normal parents didn't calculate the value of their daughter's potential death or abandon her during emergency surgery. I'd spent months thinking I was fighting to protect my inheritance. Now I realized I'd been fighting to protect my soul from people who'd been systematically destroying it for years.
The upcoming criminal trial wouldn't just determine their legal fate. It would be the final proof that choosing myself over their expectations had been the only rational response to an impossible situation. Marcus was still talking, explaining court procedures and prosecution timelines, but I was already thinking ahead to the moment when they'd face the consequences of what they'd done. Not just to me, but to Tyler, to my grandmother's legacy, and to the basic trust that should exist between parents and children. The legal machinery my grandmother had designed was working exactly as she'd intended.
But I doubted even she had anticipated just how much protection I would need from the people who were supposed to protect me. The courtroom smelled like old wood and disinfectant, a combination that reminded me uncomfortably of the hospital where this whole nightmare had begun. I sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table, wearing a navy suit that Dr. Vasquez had helped me choose the day before. She'd insisted on coming with me for moral support, understanding that facing my parents in a criminal proceeding would be unlike anything I'd ever experienced. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made itself known immediately. She'd spent hours preparing me for what would happen during the arraignment, explaining that my parents would enter their pleas and that the full scope of the charges would be read publicly for the first time. The charges were extensive. Felony theft in the first degree for the systematic draining of trust funds, wire fraud for the electronic transfers used to move money between accounts, conspiracy to commit fraud for their coordinated efforts to manipulate inheritance documents. Each charge carried potential prison sentences that would fundamentally alter the rest of their lives. At 9:30 sharp, the bailiff called the court to session. Judge Patricia Martinez entered with the kind of authoritative presence that immediately commanded respect. She was a woman in her 60s who'd built her reputation on handling complex financial crimes with both fairness and firmness. Marcus had assured me that having her assigned to the case was fortunate. She wouldn't be swayed by emotional appeals or attempts to minimize the severity of what had happened. Then the side door opened, and my parents walked in, wearing orange jail uniforms and handcuffs. The sight of them hit me like physical blow. These were the people who'd attended my school plays and graduation ceremonies, who'd taught me to drive and helped me move into my first apartment. Seeing them in criminal custody, reduced to defendants in a felony case, created a surreal disconnect that made my stomach clench with a mixture of grief and vindication. My father looked older than his 58 years, his hair disheveled and his face drawn with exhaustion. My mother maintained better composure, her posture straight and her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tremor in her hands as she was guided to the defendant's table. Neither of them looked in my direction, though I suspected they knew I was there. Their attorney was a man named David Sterling, someone with the kind of expensive suit and confident demeanor that suggested my parents had spent considerable money securing representation. He whispered urgently to them as they sat down, clearly trying to prepare them for what was about to unfold. Judge Martinez reviewed the case file briefly before addressing the court. Her voice was clear and professional as she began reading the charges, each count more damaging than the last. The theft charges alone totaled over $600,000 when Tyler's account was included. The fraud charges encompassed 3 years of systematic deception and document falsification. But it was the conspiracy charge that truly captured the magnitude of what they'd done. The prosecution had evidence that my parents had planned their financial manipulation strategy years in advance, including discussions about how to maintain access to our inheritance money even if we became suspicious of their management. When Judge Martinez asked how they pleaded, my father's attorney stood first. "Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor." The words echoed in the courtroom like a challenge thrown down. Despite the overwhelming evidence Marcus had shown me, despite the bank records and loan documents and recorded conversations, they were going to fight this case to the bitter end. Part of me had hoped they might accept responsibility and show some remorse for what they'd done. Instead, they were choosing to force a trial that would make their crimes public and put our family's dysfunction on display for the entire community. As the judge set bail and scheduled preliminary hearings, I felt something inside me crystallize into absolute resolve. They'd had multiple opportunities to come clean, to apologize, to attempt some form of restitution. Instead, they were doubling down on their lies and forcing me to prove their guilt in open court. The arraignment lasted less than 30 minutes, but the aftermath would stretch for months. As my parents were led back to holding, my father finally turned and looked directly at me. His expression wasn't apologetic or ashamed.
It was furious, as if I were the one who'd committed some unforgivable betrayal by refusing to let them steal from me without consequences. Outside the courthouse, DA Walsh walked with me to her car, explaining what would happen during the discovery phase and preparation for trial. The prosecution was confident in their case, but she warned me that defense attorneys in financial crimes often tried to shift blame to the victims, portraying them as greedy or vindictive children who'd misunderstood innocent business decisions. Your parents' attorney will likely try to paint you as an ungrateful daughter who's destroying her family over money, she said. Be prepared for them to attack your character and your motivations. They'll try to make the jury see you as the villain in this story. Dr. Vasquez drove me home from the courthouse, her presence a comfort during one of the most emotionally challenging days of my life. She'd known our family for over 15 years, had watched me grow from a shy child into an independent adult, and her perspective on what had happened carried weight that helped me process my own emotions. "You did the right thing," she said as we pulled into my apartment complex. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but protecting yourself from people who would exploit your trust isn't a betrayal. It's survival." That evening, alone in my apartment, I called Tyler. He'd been staying with friends since our parents' arrest, unwilling to return to the family home that had been partially seized as evidence in the criminal case. His voice was hollow when he answered, carrying the weight of someone whose entire worldview had collapsed in the span of a week. "I saw the news coverage," he said. "They're calling it one of the largest family financial fraud cases in Oregon history." The media attention had been intense, but respectful, focusing on the legal aspects of the case rather than sensationalizing the family drama. Still, seeing our last name associated with felony charges and criminal conspiracy had been jarring for both of us. "Tyler, I'm sorry you're going through this," I said. "I know you didn't ask for any of it. Neither did you. I've been thinking about everything you told me, about the hospital and the pressure tactics and all of it. I didn't want to believe it at first, but the evidence is pretty overwhelming." We talked for over an hour, processing the information that had come out during the investigation and trying to understand how our parents had justified their actions to themselves. Tyler admitted that he'd noticed some irregularities over the years, vague explanations about investment strategies, reluctance to provide detailed financial statements, pressure to avoid asking too many questions about money management. "I think I chose not to see it," he said. "It was easier to trust them than to consider that they might be lying to us about something so fundamental."
We were both victims of the same systematic deception, both struggling to reconcile the parents we'd thought we knew with the criminals who'd been revealed by the investigation. Over the next few weeks, the case preparation intensified. DA Walsh's team gathered additional evidence, interviewed witnesses, and built the timeline that would form the foundation of their prosecution. I spent hours reviewing financial documents, providing testimony about the pressure tactics my parents had used, and preparing for the cross-examination that would inevitably challenge my credibility and motivations. The defense strategy became clear during the preliminary hearings. Sterling argued that the trust fund transfers had been legitimate investment decisions made with implied family consent. He characterized the hospital abandonment as a misunderstanding and claimed that the pressure tactics I'd described were normal family financial planning discussions. Most disturbingly, he suggested that I had manufactured the criminal case out of spite, after being disappointed by inheritance arrangements that didn't meet my expectations. According to his version of events, I was a vindictive daughter who'd chosen to destroy my family rather than accept reasonable financial management decisions. It was exactly the character assassination DA Walsh had warned me about, but experiencing it firsthand was still devastating. Having my motivations and integrity questioned in open court by people who knew nothing about the years of emotional manipulation and financial exploitation I'd endured felt like being victimized all over again. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed unauthorized transfers that coincided with Brooks Construction's financial difficulties. Recorded conversations captured my parents discussing the inheritance money as if it belonged to them. Loan documents proved they'd used our trust funds as collateral for business debts without our knowledge of consent.
The breakthrough came during Tyler's testimony. He took the witness stand with visible reluctance, clearly uncomfortable with the role he was being asked to play in our parents' prosecution. But when DA Walsh asked him to describe his understanding of his inheritance status, his answers were devastating to the defense. "I thought the money was being managed conservatively," he said, his voice barely audible in the quiet courtroom. "When I asked for specific information about investments or growth, they always gave me general answers about market performance and long-term strategies. I never saw actual statements or documentation." Under cross-examination, Sterling tried to suggest that Tyler's lack of detailed financial knowledge proved the family's informal management approach was normal and acceptable. But Tyler's response destroyed that argument completely. "I didn't ask for detailed information because I trusted them," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I thought parents were supposed to protect their children's interests, not exploit them. If I'd known they were borrowing against my inheritance to save their failing business, I would have stopped them immediately." The courtroom was silent as Tyler stepped down from the witness stand. Even Sterling seemed to recognize that his cross-examination had backfired, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that our parents had deliberately kept us uninformed to prevent us from discovering their theft. My own testimony came later in the week, and it was the most emotionally difficult experience of my life. DA Walsh guided me through the timeline of events, from the hospital abandonment through the pressure tactics and manipulation attempts. I described the artificial urgency they'd created, the misleading financial projections they'd presented, and the systematic way they'd attempted to gain control over my inheritance. But it was Sterling's cross-examination that nearly broke me. He attacked everything, from my decision to record conversations to my motivations for consulting an attorney.
He suggested that I'd been looking for reasons to cut my parents out of my life and had manufactured a criminal case to justify my vindictive behavior. "Isn't it true," he said, pacing in front of the witness stand, "that you were angry about being asked to make responsible financial decisions about your inheritance?" "No," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I was angry about being lied to, manipulated, and abandoned when I needed my family most. But you've admitted that your parents provided for you throughout your childhood and supported your education and career development. Doesn't that suggest they genuinely cared about your well-being?" The question was designed to make me appear ungrateful, but it also gave me the opportunity to articulate something I'd been thinking about for months. Loving parents don't abandon their daughter during emergency surgery, I said, looking directly at Sterling. They don't calculate the financial benefits of her potential death. They don't steal money that belongs to her and then try to manipulate her into signing away what's left. Everything they did after my 21st birthday was about accessing my inheritance, not protecting my well-being. The courtroom was completely silent as I finished speaking. Even Sterling seemed momentarily at a loss for his next question. In that moment, I felt the power of speaking truth in a place designed to determine fact from fiction, accountability from excuse-making. The prosecution rested their case after 2 weeks of testimony, having presented evidence that painted a clear picture of systematic financial abuse disguised as family financial planning. The defense's case was much shorter, consisting mainly of character witnesses who testified about my parents' community involvement and business reputation. But none of the character witnesses could explain away the bank records or justify the unauthorized use of trust fund money. None of them could provide legitimate reasons for the pressure tactics or the manipulation attempts I'd documented. Their testimony felt like an attempt to distract from the evidence rather than address it directly. Closing arguments took place on a Thursday morning in late June.
DA Walsh methodically reviewed the evidence, connecting the financial documents to the pattern of manipulation and deception that had characterized my parents' behavior for years. She argued that their actions represented a fundamental betrayal of parental duty and legal obligation. Sterling's closing argument focused on family loyalty and the difficulties of managing complex financial arrangements. He portrayed my parents as well-intentioned business people who'd made some procedural mistakes while trying to protect their children's financial interests. He suggested that criminal prosecution was an overreaction to what should have been handled as a civil family dispute. But his argument fell flat in the face of the evidence. The jury had seen too much documentation of deliberate deception and systematic theft to accept the characterization of innocent mistakes or good intentions gone wrong. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. When the foreman read each count aloud, my parents sat motionless at the defendant's table, finally forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month, but the guilty verdicts meant that the criminal case was essentially over. My parents would face significant prison time, and their convictions would be permanently part of the public record. The family reputation they'd worked so hard to build and protect had been destroyed by their own greed and manipulation. As the courtroom emptied and my parents were led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and vindication. Justice had been served, but at the cost of any remaining family relationships. The people who'd raised me were going to prison for stealing from me, and nothing would ever make that reality less devastating. Outside the courthouse, DA Walsh shook my hand and commended me for having the courage to come forward with evidence of the financial abuse.
Cases like this are difficult to prosecute because family members are often reluctant to hold their loved ones accountable, she said. Your willingness to seek justice helped protect other potential victims and showed that financial exploitation won't be tolerated, regardless of family relationships. Dr. Vasquez was waiting by my car, having attended the verdict announcement, to provide support during this final phase of the legal process. As we drove away from the courthouse, she asked how I was feeling about everything that had happened. Grateful, I said, surprising myself with the answer. Grateful to my grandmother for protecting me. Grateful to you for supporting me. Grateful that I found the strength to fight back instead of letting them destroy my future along with my trust. The criminal trial was over, but the real work of rebuilding my life was just beginning. I had my inheritance back, secured and protected from any further family interference. I had the truth about who my parents really were, painful as it was to accept. And I had the knowledge that I'd chosen my own well-being over the comfort of family myths and false loyalty. Most importantly, I had proof that speaking up about abuse, even when it comes from the people who are supposed to love you most, is not betrayal. It's survival. Sentencing day arrived with unseasonable August heat that made the courthouse steps shimmer like a mirage. I stood outside the building at 8 in the morning, watching other families navigate their own legal crises, wondering if any of them were experiencing the same surreal mixture of vindication and grief that had become my constant companion. Judge Martinez had scheduled the sentencing hearing for 9 o'clock, and DA Walsh had warned me that my parents would likely make statements asking for leniency. Their attorney had filed motion after motion requesting reduced sentences, community service alternatives, and delayed incarceration to allow them to settle their business affairs. Each filing had been a reminder that they still believed it could manipulate their way out of consequences. Tyler met me at the courthouse entrance, looking older than his 27 years. The stress of the trial and media attention had taken a visible toll on him, but he'd insisted on being present for the sentencing. We'd grown closer during the legal proceedings, bonded by the shared experience of discovering that our entire childhood had been built on lies and manipulation. Inside the courtroom, my parents sat at the defendant's table wearing civilian clothes for the first time since their arrest.
My mother had chosen a conservative gray dress that projected maternal respectability, while my father wore his most expensive suit, the one he'd always claimed made him look trustworthy during business negotiations. Even facing prison sentences, they were still performing their roles as upstanding community members. Judge Martinez entered promptly at 9, her expression giving no indication of what sentences she'd decided upon. The prosecution had recommended significant prison time based on the scope of the theft and the systematic nature of the deception. The defense had argued for leniency based on my parents' community ties and lack of prior criminal history. But I knew Judge Martinez had been particularly troubled by one aspect of the case that had emerged during testimony. The evidence showed that my parents had accelerated their theft activities after my surgery, treating my medical emergency as an opportunity to extract additional money while I was physically and emotionally vulnerable. That calculated exploitation of my crisis had seemed to anger her more than the underlying financial crimes. The sentencing process began with victim impact statements. DA Walsh had explained that Tyler and I could address the court about how the crimes had affected us personally, but I had initially been reluctant to speak.
The legal proceedings had already exposed so much family dysfunction that adding emotional testimony felt like reopening wounds that were just beginning to heal. But Dr. Vasquez had encouraged me to take the opportunity, arguing that my parents needed to hear directly from me about the consequences of their actions, not for their benefit, but for mine. The chance to speak my truth in a forum where they couldn't interrupt, manipulate, or deflect might help me find closure that had been elusive throughout the trial process. Tyler spoke first, his voice steady but filled with pain, as he described the betrayal of discovering that the people he'd trusted most had been systematically stealing from him for years. He talked about the loss of financial security, but more importantly, the loss of faith in family relationships that would affect him for the rest of his life. They didn't just steal money, he said, looking directly at our parents. They stole my ability to trust that love and family loyalty are real. They taught me that even the people who are supposed to protect you will exploit you if given the opportunity. When my turn came, I walked to the podium feeling strangely calm. I'd spent months preparing for this moment, not just legally but emotionally, trying to find words that would capture the full scope of what had been taken from me. Your Honor, I began, this case has been described as financial theft, but what really happened was the systematic destruction of a daughter's trust in her parents. The money can be recovered and returned. The relationship damage cannot be repaired. I described waking up alone in the hospital, the confusion and hurt of being abandoned during a medical crisis, and the slow realization that my parents had been calculating the financial benefits of my potential death while I fought for my life under anesthesia. They taught me that my value to them was measured in dollars rather than love, I continued. When they pressured me to sign over my inheritance, they weren't trying to protect my financial future. They were trying to complete a theft they'd been planning for years. But the most important part of my statement focused on the future rather than the past. I explained how the experience had taught me to recognize manipulation and exploitation, skills that would protect me in future relationships and professional situations. I'd learned to trust my instincts and set boundaries, even when doing so was painful or socially uncomfortable. Their crimes forced me to become stronger and more independent than I might have been otherwise, I said. In trying to control and exploit me, they actually freed me from ever being vulnerable to that kind of manipulation again. As I returned to my seat, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole ordeal began: genuine peace. I'd spoken my truth completely and honestly, without anger or vindictiveness, but with absolute clarity about what had happened and how it had affected me. My mother's attorney requested permission for her to address the court before sentencing. She stood slowly, her hands clasped in front of her, and delivered what sounded like a carefully rehearsed speech about family misunderstandings and parental love gone astray. Your Honor, she said, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine emotion, I know our actions have caused pain to our children, but everything we did was motivated by love and concern for their future security. We made mistakes in our financial management, but we never intended to harm them.
It was a masterful performance combining acknowledgement of wrongdoing with denial of criminal intent. She portrayed herself as a misguided mother who'd made poor decisions while trying to protect her children, rather than a calculated criminal who'd systematically stolen from them. My father's statement was briefer but followed the same theme. He apologized for causing family discord and claimed that business pressures had led him to make choices he now regretted.
He asked the court to consider the impact of incarceration on their ability to make restitution and rebuild family relationships. But Judge Martinez had heard enough victim impact statements and reviewed enough evidence to see through the manipulation that characterized even their sentencing pleas. When she announced the sentences, her voice carried the authority of someone who understood exactly what kind of people she was dealing with. This court has reviewed extensive evidence of systematic financial exploitation that spanned multiple years and involved sophisticated planning and deception, she said. The defendants used their positions as parents and trustees to commit crimes that fundamentally betrayed their obligations to their children. She sentenced my father to 4 years in state prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. My mother received 3 years incarceration with 2 years probation. Both sentences included requirements for full financial restitution and permanent restrictions on serving as trustees or financial managers for family members. But it was Judge Martinez's closing comments that provided the vindication I hadn't realized I needed. She looked directly at my parents as she spoke, her voice carrying decades of experience with criminals who tried to excuse their behavior through emotional manipulation. The evidence shows that you treated your children's trust and love as resources to be exploited for your own financial benefit, she said. You abandoned your daughter during a medical emergency and then attempted to use her vulnerability to extract additional concessions. These are not the actions of loving parents who made mistakes. These are the calculated crimes of individuals who prioritized personal gain over family welfare. The sentencing hearing concluded with my parents being taken into custody immediately. There would be no delay for personal affairs or gradual transition to incarceration. They were led away in handcuffs, finally facing the consequences they'd tried so hard to avoid through manipulation and legal maneuvering. Outside the courthouse, Tyler and I stood in the afternoon heat, processing what had just happened. The criminal case was officially over, the sentences had been imposed, and our parents were beginning prison terms that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of their lives. "How do you feel?" Tyler asked, and I realized I'd been wondering the same thing about him. "Relief," I said after thinking about it. Not happiness or satisfaction, just relief that it's finally over and that the truth was recognized officially. We drove to a quiet cafe near the river, wanting to decompress somewhere peaceful after months of courthouse visits and legal proceedings. Over coffee and pastries, we talked about practical matters like estate settlement and property disposition, but also about the emotional work of rebuilding our understanding of family and trust. "I keep thinking about all the times they seemed genuinely caring," Tyler said. "Birthday celebrations and graduations and family vacations. Were they just performing the whole time, or were there moments when they actually loved us without calculating the cost?" It was a question I'd been grappling with throughout the trial. The parents who taught me to ride a bike and helped with homework felt like completely different people from the criminals who'd stolen my inheritance and abandoned me during surgery. Reconciling those contradictory realities required accepting that people could be both loving and exploitative, sometimes simultaneously. "I think they loved us as extensions of themselves," I said. "When we made them look good or fulfilled their expectations, the love was real. But when our independence threatened their control or financial interests, we became problems to be solved rather than people to be protected." Dr. Vasquez joined us at the cafe, having attended the sentencing hearing as both professional supporter and family friend. Her perspective on our parents' behavior carried the weight of years of observation and medical training in family dynamics. "Narcissistic family structures often produce exactly this kind of conditional love," she explained.
Children are valued for what they provide to the parents rather than for who they are as individuals.
When the children become independent adults with their own resources and decision-making capacity, the parents feel threatened and often escalate their control tactics. She'd seen similar patterns in other families, though rarely with the criminal elements that had characterized our situation. The combination of financial desperation and narcissistic control had created a perfect storm that ultimately destroyed any authentic family relationships, while exposing the underlying pathology that had always existed. Over the following weeks, I began the practical work of rebuilding my life without the constant stress of legal proceedings and family manipulation. The inheritance money was fully restored and secured in accounts that no one else could access. Tyler's trust fund was similarly protected, and we'd both learned enough about financial management to ensure we'd never be vulnerable to exploitation again. But the emotional reconstruction proved more complex than the financial recovery. I found myself questioning memories and interactions from throughout my childhood, trying to identify patterns of manipulation that I'd been too young or naive to recognize at the time. Some conversations with Dr. Vasquez helped me understand that this analytical process was normal and healthy, part of developing the awareness that would protect me in future relationships. The media attention gradually faded as the news cycle moved on to other stories, but the case had attracted enough public interest to generate several follow-up articles about family financial abuse and inheritance protection. I declined most interview requests, preferring to process the experience privately rather than turn it into a public platform. However, I did agree to speak with a journalist who was writing about estate planning protections for young adults. My grandmother's legal framework had saved me from financial ruin, and I wanted other people to understand the importance of building similar safeguards into their own family planning. The most important lesson, I told the reporter, is that love shouldn't require you to surrender your independence or financial security. Family members who genuinely care about your welfare want you to be protected and empowered, not vulnerable and dependent. 3 months after the sentencing, I received an unexpected letter from my mother's prison counselor. She had been assigned to a minimum security facility about 2 hours from Portland, and the counselor explained that she was requesting permission to write to me as part of her rehabilitation program. The request created a complicated emotional response. Part of me was curious about what she might say after months of incarceration and mandatory counseling. Another part of me was wary of any continued attempts to manipulate or control the narrative about what had happened between us. I discussed the decision with Dr. Vasquez, who helped me understand that I had complete control over any future contact with my parents. I could choose to read their letters or ignore them, respond or maintain silence, engage with their rehabilitation process, or protect myself from further manipulation attempts. After considerable thought, I decided to read the letter but reserve judgment about any ongoing communication until I understood what kind of accountability they were willing to accept for their crimes. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in November, written on standard prison stationery in my mother's familiar handwriting. It was longer than I'd expected, covering several pages of careful script that suggested considerable thought and revision. She began by acknowledging the pain her actions had caused and accepting responsibility for the financial crimes without the excuses and justifications that had characterized her trial testimony. She described the counseling she'd been receiving and her growing understanding of how narcissistic behavior patterns had damaged our family relationships.
But the most meaningful part of the letter focused on my medical crisis and her decision to leave the hospital during my surgery. She wrote with what seemed like genuine remorse about abandoning me when I needed family support most, acknowledging that her absence had been motivated by discomfort with emotional vulnerability rather than any legitimate emergency. I realize now that I treated your health crisis as an inconvenience rather than a moment when you needed your mother most, she wrote. There is no excuse for that abandonment, and I understand why it became the catalyst for your decision to investigate our financial management. You deserved better from me during that vulnerable time. The letter concluded with a request for eventual forgiveness, but without pressure for immediate reconciliation or ongoing contact. She acknowledged that rebuilding trust would require consistent demonstration of changed behavior over time, and that I had every right to protect myself from further harm by maintaining distance. I read the letter several times, analyzing the tone and content for signs of continued manipulation.
While some phrases felt rehearsed and self-serving, the overall message seemed more authentic than anything I'd heard from her during the trial proceedings. Tyler received a similar letter from our father, and we compared the contents to see if they represented genuine accountability or coordinated attempts to reestablish contact for manipulative purposes. Tyler's letter contained more defensive language and implied blame shifting, suggesting that our father remained less capable of genuine remorse than our mother. After much consideration, I decided to respond to my mother's letter with a brief note acknowledging receipt and explaining my boundaries for any future communication. I made it clear that I wasn't ready for reconciliation or regular contact, but that I appreciated her willingness to accept responsibility for her actions. The response I wrote was careful and measured, designed to maintain my boundaries while leaving open the possibility of future communication if she continued demonstrating genuine change. I explained that trust would need to be rebuilt gradually through consistent actions rather than words, and that any attempts to manipulate or pressure me would result in permanent cessation of contact. 6 months later, I received a second letter that showed continued progress in her understanding of the damage she'd caused. She'd completed several rehabilitation programs and was working with a counselor who specialized in family relationship repair. More importantly, she'd begun making restitution payments even before they were officially required, using her prison commissary earnings to start repaying the money she'd stolen. The gesture was small in financial terms, but significant as a demonstration of genuine remorse and commitment to making amends. It suggested that her accountability was developing beyond words into concrete actions that required personal sacrifice. But perhaps the most healing development came from an unexpected source. Dr. Vasquez introduced me to a support group for adults who'd experienced family financial abuse, and I discovered that my experience, while it was part of a much larger pattern of family exploitation and manipulation. Meeting other people who'd survived similar betrayals helped me understand that the emotional damage I'd experienced was normal and treatable, not a permanent disability that would affect all my future relationships. The group included people who'd rebuilt healthy family connections after abuse, others who'd chosen permanent estrangement, and many who'd found middle ground approaches that protected them while allowing limited contact. Listening to their stories helped me realize that there was no single right way to handle family betrayal, and that my decisions about future contact with my parents could evolve as my healing progressed and their behavior patterns changed or remained static. A year after the sentencing, I made a decision that surprised even me. I agreed to participate in a family counseling session at the prison where my mother was incarcerated.
The session would be facilitated by a therapist who specialized in family reconciliation after criminal abuse and would include strict protocols to prevent manipulation or pressure tactics. The meeting took place in a small conference room with institutional furniture and security cameras, a setting that reinforced the reality of what had happened while providing the structure necessary for safe communication. My mother looked older and thinner than I remembered, wearing a prison uniform that stripped away the polished exterior she'd always maintained. The session focused primarily on accountability and understanding rather than reconciliation or forgiveness. The therapist guided us through a structured conversation about the impact of her crimes on my life, her motivations for committing them, and the changes she'd made during incarceration to address the underlying behavioral patterns. What struck me most was her willingness to sit with uncomfortable emotions rather than deflecting or minimizing her responsibility. When I described the fear and abandonment I'd felt waking up alone in the hospital, she didn't interrupt with explanations or excuses. She simply listened and acknowledged the pain her absence had caused. I was so focused on the financial opportunities your medical crisis might create that I lost sight of the fact that you were my daughter who needed comfort and support, she said. I treated you like a business asset rather than a human being who was scared and vulnerable. The conversation didn't heal our relationship or restore trust, but it provided something I hadn't realized I needed: confirmation that my perceptions of what had happened were accurate and that the damage I'd experienced was real and significant. I left the prison feeling emotionally drained, but also strangely lighter, as if I'd been carrying the weight of questions that had finally been answered.
The meeting didn't change my boundaries or lead to regular contact, but it gave me closure about the past and clarity about what would be required for any future relationship. 2 years after the trial, I found myself in a very different place than I'd ever imagined possible. The inheritance my grandmother had protected allowed me to purchase a small house in southeast Portland, close enough to the city for work but with enough space for the art studio I'd always wanted. My graphic design business had grown substantially, partly because the media attention from the trial had generated unexpected publicity, but mostly because the experience had taught me to trust my instincts and set firm boundaries with clients who tried to manipulate or exploit creative workers. Tyler and I had developed a closer relationship than we'd ever had as children, bonded by shared experience and mutual support during the most difficult period of our lives. He'd used his recovered inheritance to finish his master's degree and start a nonprofit organization that provided financial literacy education to young adults aging out of foster care. Dr. Vasquez remained a close friend and informal mentor, someone who'd witnessed my transformation from a naive young woman who trusted too easily into a confident adult who could protect herself while still remaining open to authentic relationships. But perhaps the most unexpected development was my decision to volunteer with a legal aid organization that helped other victims of family financial abuse navigate the complex process of protecting their assets and seeking accountability for exploitation. Working with other survivors helped me understand that my grandmother's legal protections had been extraordinary and that most people facing similar abuse lacked the resources and framework necessary to fight back effectively. The volunteer work also provided perspective on my own healing journey. Helping other people recognize manipulation tactics and build protective boundaries reinforced my own recovery, while giving meaning to an experience that had initially felt like pure victimization. On the 3rd anniversary of my surgery, I returned to St. Vincent Medical Center for a routine checkup with Dr. Patel. Walking through the same corridors where I'd been abandoned by my parents felt surreal, but no longer traumatic. The scared young woman who'd called her parents from the emergency room had been replaced by someone who understood that family obligations run both directions and that love shouldn't require surrendering your autonomy or financial security. Dr. Patel commented on how much stronger and more confident I seemed compared to our previous appointments, and I realized he was right. The experience that had initially felt like the worst thing that could happen to me had ultimately become the catalyst for developing resilience and self-protection skills that would serve me for the rest of my life. That evening, I sat in my art studio, working on a painting that captured the view from my hospital room window, the same view I'd stared at while processing the reality of my parents' abandonment. But instead of recreating the fear and confusion I'd felt then, the painting reflected the peace and strength I'd found in the years since. The canvas showed light breaking through storm clouds, illuminating a landscape that had been transformed by the very forces that had initially threatened to destroy it. It wasn't a metaphor for forgiveness or reconciliation, but for the possibility of building something beautiful from the ruins of what had been lost. As I worked, I thought about my grandmother and the foresight that had saved me from financial ruin and emotional destruction. She'd understood something about family dynamics that I'd been too young and hopeful to see. That love without boundaries isn't really love at all, but a form of control that diminishes everyone it touches. Her legal protections had given me more than financial security. They'd given me the tools to recognize my own worth and defend it against people who saw my kindness as weakness and my trust as opportunity. The inheritance she'd left wasn't just money, it was the wisdom to understand that protecting yourself from exploitation isn't selfish or vindictive, but necessary for building authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler, asking if I wanted to join him for dinner to celebrate the anniversary of our parents' sentencing. It had become an annual tradition. Not to celebrate their imprisonment, but to acknowledge our survival and continued growth despite the trauma they'd inflicted. As I cleaned my brushes and prepared to meet my brother, I reflected on how much had changed since that morning when I'd woken up alone in a hospital room. The family I'd been born into had been destroyed by greed and manipulation, but the family I'd chosen, Tyler, Dr. Vasquez, my support group friends, and the clients who'd become genuine colleagues, was built on foundations that couldn't be shaken by financial pressure or emotional blackmail. I'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone's destructive behavior, even when that someone is family. Sometimes protecting yourself requires walking away from people who see your loyalty as a resource to be exploited rather than a gift to be cherished. The criminal trial had provided legal vindication and financial recovery, but the real victory was quieter and more personal. It was the confidence to trust my own perceptions, the strength to maintain boundaries under pressure, and the wisdom to distinguish between love that empowers and manipulation that destroys. Standing in my studio, surrounded by art that reflected my journey from victim to survivor to someone who could help others navigate similar challenges, I understood that my grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the money she'd protected. It had been the example she'd set of a woman who knew her own worth and refused to let anyone diminish it.
The scared young woman who'd called her parents from an emergency room was gone, replaced by someone who understood that family isn't defined by blood relations or shared history, but by consistent care, respect, and genuine concern for each other's well-being. Some families are born, others are chosen, and the strongest are built on foundations of mutual protection rather than mutual exploitation. As I turned off the studio lights and headed out to meet Tyler, I felt grateful for the painful experience that had ultimately freed me from relationships that were slowly destroying my capacity for trust and authentic connection. The criminal trial was over, the financial recovery was complete, but the most important transformation was ongoing. Learning to build relationships based on genuine care rather than obligation, and understanding that real love empowers rather than controls. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.